Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Junior English. We now turn to, in your hymnal, 964, 965 and following, and the introduction to the history of Unit 5. You should just now be taking notes because we're going to flow this information. Notice that Unit 5 is called Prosperity and Protest, Literature of the Post-War Era. Note your dates, 1945 to 1970. Notice your Lorena Hansberry line there on page 965. Sometimes I can see the future stretched out in front of me, just as plain as day. The future hanging over there at the edge of my days, just waiting for me. Let's turn now to page 966. We've got a snapshot of the period, as they call it, right? The 1950s began with a booming consumer economy, the birth of the American car culture, the rise of suburbia as a new lifestyle norm. By the end of the decade, this apparent stability showed signs of strain. In 1957, the Soviet Union, America's Cold War opponent, launched the first Earth-orbiting satellite, and the United States entered the space race in dire earnestness. Unrest in the nation over civil rights issues led to protests, some organized and peaceful, some violent. The war in Vietnam began in 1954, did not end until 1975. It became a focal point of political and generational conflict. A period that began with complacency ended with a spirit of revolution and the sense of a new age dawning. You have a number of people there at the bottom of of that little bit on 966 with some pictures. Notice on 967, Writing for Freedom. In 1961, a historic moment in the civil rights movement took place when a group of freedom riders challenged segregation codes in buses and bus terminals. They rode in integrated buses from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. Along the way, buses were firebombed, riders were beaten, and finally federal marshals were called in. You have a number of these buttons of the era, and you might want to take a look at those on 967. And you've also got a chart there about the Vietnam War and the approval rates as it began to drop. Let's go ahead now and turn to 968. While I'm not going to say anything about the timeline at the bottom of these pages, I do recommend that you pay attention to them. Let's again now go through this. Again, all your notes that you're taking, starting with these headings. Write down the headings and one or two things that you want to know. Again, the dates: 1945, the end of the war, to 1970. Let's read. The United States emerged from World War II as the most powerful nation on earth. Proud of their role in the Allied victory, Americans now wanted life to return to normal. Soldiers came home, rationing of scarce goods ended, and the nation prospered. Despite post-war jubilation, however, the dawn of the nuclear age and the dominance of the Soviet Union throughout Eastern Europe meant enormous new challenges. In 1945, the United Nations was created. I would write that down. In 1945, the United Nations was created amid high hopes that it would prevent future wars. Nonetheless, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West began as soon as World War II ended. Of course, we call it a Cold War because technically it was not hot war, it wasn't fighting, but it was obviously a threat, and that's why we call it a Cold War. Okay? Nuclear fears obviously abounded, right? Nonetheless, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West began as soon as World War II ended. Armed conflict arose in 1950 when President Harry S. Truman sent American troops to help anti-communist South Korea forces turn back a North Korean invasion. Within our borders, fear of communism fueled the witch hunts of the 1950s, unleashing investigations and accusations by Senator Joseph McCarthy that ruined the careers and reputations of many Americans. The complacent 50s. Notice your headings. I hope these are in your notes. The complacent 50s. Americans of the 1950s are sometimes called the silent generation. Many of them had lived through both the Great Depression and World War II, and they were tired to the bone of sacrifice and conflict. When peace finally arrived, they were glad to adopt quiet ways of living. They wanted to stay at home, raise their families, and enjoy being consumers. They wanted to keep life the way it was for a while. But the march of technology made complacency impossible. In October of 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. The space age had begun, and the Soviet triumph spurred calls for changes in American education, especially in science and math. President John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, promised to, quote, get the nation moving again, end quote, and he set in motion an intense national effort to land an American on the moon. Top of page 969, the turbulent 60s. The assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 was a deeply felt national tragedy. After the assassination came an escalating and increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam. Waves of protest disrupted the country's complacency. Gone were the calm of the 1950s and the high hopes of Kennedy's brief administration. In their place came idealistic but strident demands for an end to the war, progress on civil rights, and greater relevance in education. It was a time of crisis and confrontation, but it also brought genuine progress. Lasting gains were made in civil rights during these years. In 1954, the Supreme Court had outlawed segregation in public schools, and the 60s witnessed the continuing battle for racial equality. Tragedy struck again in 1968, however, when civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Riots broke out in many cities across the nation. The next heading, culture and counterculture. Through the 50s and 60s, television continued to spearhead a revolution in mass communication. By 1960, millions of Americans owned televisions and masses of people shared common electronic experiences of news, entertainment, and advertising. At the same time, groups of Americans sought lifestyles that opposed the prevailing culture. In music, art, literature, occupation, speech, and dress, these Americans resisted the sameness and anonymity that seemed to be consuming the nation's personality. The key historical theme here, recovery and rebellion. We got 2 bullet points. During the 50s, many Americans who had lived through the Great Depression and World War II craved normalcy. The second one, during the 60s, many Americans protested against the Vietnam War, racial injustice, and social conformity. All right, let's turn to page 970. Essential questions across time, the post-war era, again, your dates, 1945 to 1970. And the question is, how does literature shape or reflect society? Notice your first question. What social and political events affected Americans in the quarter century after World War II? First, the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. As the war ended, concentration camps were liberated, and journalists reported in shocking words and images the horrific facts of the Holocaust. If you haven't done it, you should Google image some of that information and just take a look. Of course, it's going to be a tragic thing for you to see as you look at it. In addition, the reality of the atomic bomb gave people all over the world a new fear and new responsibility for managing international conflict. Next heading, wars, both cold and hot. With the rise of the Soviet Union, the Cold War competition between Eastern Bloc countries and the West became intense. Fear of unchecked Soviet aggression marked the period. Espionage, economic sanctions, treaties, defense measures, diplomatic conflicts were constantly in the news. In Korea and in Vietnam, many Americans fought and died facing communist forces. Next heading, civil rights struggles and the women's movements. During the 60s, protests against racism gave way to riots. Many cities seethed as African Americans demanded change. Television brought the anguish into every living room. During these years, the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and Senator Robert F. Kennedy underscored the violence of the decade. At the same time, women struggled for greater economic and social power, changing the American workforce and the political landscape. By the way, you do see 3 essential vocabulary words there, international diplomacy and protest. Make sure they are as well in your notes from page 970. Page 971. What values and attitudes grew from these events? That's the question. Let's answer it. First bullet point. Age of anxiety versus age of Aquarius. The fear and violence of the post-war period characterized it as an age of anxiety. Americans seemed unable to stop thinking about terrible things that could or might happen. Schools regularly held air raid drills, and communists were hunted everywhere. By the late 60s, however, some Americans put forth an alternate set of idealistic values that called for an age of Aquarius, an era of universal peace and love. Seeking conformity, our next heading. During the 1950s, the nation enjoyed widespread prosperity. Suburbs expanded. The consumer society flourished. As a result, many Americans relished and even demanded social conformity. Beneath the surface, however, anxiety lurked. For example, in 1954, the United States Information Agency banned Henry David Thoreau's Walden from American embassy libraries for being downright socialistic, quote unquote. Protesting conformity. As the 60s wore on, more and more Americans made strong assertions of their individuality. People resisted living with conformity and fear. This new spirit of independence energized the passions for justice and equality that swept the nations. By the way, here we have a sidebar note on page 971. The landscapes of Richard Diebenkorn. After World War II, abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock created paintings that drew attention to the process of how they were made. By the way, you can Google image Jackson Pollock to see what his paintings look like. Their abstract forms emphasized a complex inner reality over a straightforward representation of the outer world. In the 1960s, however, Richard Diebenkorn combined the dynamic energy of abstract forms with shapes that evoked sunny California landscapes. Diebenkorn captured vibrant West Coast color and light in his pictures. You can again Google image this. He was able to suggest the land, the sky, the ocean, and the buildings that fragment a scene into blocks of color, and yet at the same time present a unified, humanized landscape. In his 1963 painting Cityscape, Landscape Number 1, and again you can Google search this to see it, fully achieves this blend of abstract thought and warm feeling. Later in his career, Diebenkorn shifted to an even more abstract approach. However, his long series of paintings called Ocean Park, and again you can Google image this, continued to suggest landscape-like images. Ocean Park is a community near Santa Monica, California, and this particular American place seems to have provided the artist with a firm ground for his stunning abstract visions. Okay, let's go ahead now to page 972, The American Experience, Jack Kerouac, king of the road trip. Contemporary connection. Jack Kerouac was one of the original Beats, a group of cutting-edge writers and artists that emerged during the 1950s. Daring, rebellious, intelligent, and mobile, the Beats gave voice to a new generation. Kerouac's best-known work is On the Road, a novel inspired by cross-country road trips. The book was reputedly written in a full-throttle, 3-week creative frenzy. In fact, the original manuscript of On the Road is a continuous scroll made by taping tracing paper end to end. The scroll is typewritten, has no margins, no paragraphs indent, and is single-spaced. It still exists. It was purchased by a private collector in 2001 and can be viewed by the public whenever it's on tour. It was displayed at the New York Public Library in 2007 and at the University of Texas at Austin in 2008. You can Google search this as well and for a Google image if you want. Once Kerouac typed the scroll in 1951, it was not snapped up by publishers. That was not to happen until 1957. After it was published, though, the New York Times called On the Road the most beautifully executed, the clearest and most important utterance, end quote, of Kerouac's generation. On the 50th anniversary of On the Road's publication, fellow Beat figure Lawrence Ferlinghetti said, quote, "The road doesn't exist anymore in America. There's this huge nostalgia for it. That's one of the reasons On the Road is more popular than ever," end quote. I'm now reading with you on 973. The question, how did these values and attitudes emerge in literature? Let's look at the headings. From anxiety to irony. In the years just after World War II, literature dealt with the grief and shock of the conflict. Journalist John Hersey's Hiroshima appeared in 1946, graphically depicting the effects of the atomic bomb on the lives of ordinary Japanese citizens. In 1948, Randall Jarrell published Losses, intense poems that captured the feeling of post-war emptiness. By the 1960s, however, some writers were treating the war with tragic comic irony. Joseph Heller's Catch-22 in 1961 and Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s Slaughterhouse-Five in 1969 mixed bitterness with absurdity and fantasy that helped to distance readers from the mid-century violence. I would recommend both of those novels to you, although both of them very controversial. Catch-22 and Slaughterhouse-Five. The next heading, Literature with Purpose. The fight for racial equality generated powerful literary statements, including the autobiographical fiction of Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, and Richard Wright, the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks and Robert Hayden, the plays of Lorraine Hansberry, and the speeches and essays of Martin Luther King Jr. Equality for women was one of the purposes that drove the poems of Sylvia Plath, Adrienne Rich, and Denise Levertov. A general spirit of protest underlay the achievements of beat poets like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, while folk musician Bob Dylan produced lyrics that ask piercing social questions. Perhaps the finest socially purposeful literature of that time was Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, the 1953 play that attacked the anti-communist congressional hearings chaired by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. Final heading, Popular culture sails along. On a very different note, the 2 decades after World War II were high times for the Broadway musical. All over America, people were humming tunes from South Pacific, The King and I, The Music Man, Bye Bye Birdie, West Side Story, The Sound of Music, and many other sparkling shows. Fans went crazy with Beatlemania, and families gathered every night around the electronic hearth, the television, to enjoy sitcoms like I Love Lucy and Father Knows Best, westerns like Gunsmoke and Bonanza, and the science fiction tales of the Twilight Zone. All right, let's keep going. 974. Next question. What makes American literature American? The question, what themes did American writers consider important? Let's read these now together. 974. Stay focused with me. Prosperity. While the conspicuous consumption of consumer goods seemed to make people's lives easier, it also raised questions about the national character. Writers wondered about the realities of the American dream. What did the pursuit of happiness really mean? The theme of success and its steep price was an important strand in post-war literature. Rebellion. During the 1960s, themes of rebellion ran through American writings. These were not the kinds of rebellious thoughts that Americans had expressed 200 years earlier. Americans were not rebelling against a colonial government. They were rebelling against a culture that they themselves had created. Countercultural movements gave rise to a variety of avant-garde artistic accomplishments with rebellion at their core. Next heading, race. After World War II, issues of race took on enormous urgency. When Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I have a dream," many Americans realized that the American dream itself still needed work. This theme asserted itself in literature just as the civil rights struggle unfolded in American streets. The next question, what roles did American writers play at this time? First heading, the witness. In the literature that looked back at World War II, the writer's role was that of witness to history. Like Randall Jarrell, the writer was the one who had seen the horrors and lived to tell about them. We will look at Jarrell's Death of the Baltic Gunner. Like John Hersey, the writer was the journalist or historian who could describe what had happened. The writer was also the witness to what was currently happening to the country. When Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, he took on the role of witness to the effects of the rampant fear of communism. Next heading, the nonconformist. Throughout history, writers have often set themselves apart from the mainstream of society. In the 1960s, however, they began to stand apart in greater numbers. These men and women were not rebels without a cause. They had causes galore. They were anti-war, anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-materialism, and anti-conformity. Earlier in the century, modernists had usually confined their rebellions to artistic norms. By mid-century, many writers sought to alter social norms as well. The standard bearer, the next heading. Writers took on the vital act of articulating the principles that drove many social movements. They fulfilled this role directly in nonfiction and indirectly in fiction and poetry. Wielding the weapon of words, African-American writers such as James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison gave definition to the black experience, inspiring commitment and change. In the works of Sylvia Plath, Gwendolyn Brooks, and Adrienne Rich, and many others, the women's movement in America found not only high literary art, but also deep pride and energy. By the way, just look back quickly to 974 for a second and notice your 3 vocab words there. Could end up on the examination, right? Prosperity, rebellion, avant-garde. Our next question heading. At mid-century, how did writers build on the past? I'm on page 975. First heading. Enlightening the present. American writers minded American history for parallels to their own era. In The Crucible, Arthur Miller shed light on the 1950s by examining a fearful incident of colonial history. In Frederick Douglass, the poem, Robert Hayden looked back to the fight for freedom during the Civil War years to inspire the fight for freedom in the 1960s. The next heading, continuing forms and styles. Poets such as Robert Lowell, Elizabeth Bishop, Richard Wilbur composed sonnets and sestinas framing modern views in traditional forms. Novelists such as John Steinbeck continued to tell realistic stories, and the tradition of the Southern Gothic lived on in the work of William Faulkner, Carson McFullers, Flannery O'Connor, and others. Of course, we did William Faulkner's Rose for Emily already. Keeping modernism alive. The modernist impulse that had revolutionized literature earlier in the century marched on into the 1950s. During these years, modernist artists produced some of the greatest works, including William Carlos Williams Patterson, Wallace Stevens' The Auroras of Autumn, and Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. Let's keep going. 976. The question, what is the relationship between literature and place? First question heading, how did World War II settings appear in American writing? The battlefields of Europe, the jungles of the Pacific Islands, and the devastated cities of Japan provide